Elden Ring is a great game. I want to start by saying that because the ambition, dedication and passion on display in this game are as plain to see in the first 10 minutes as they are in the 100th hour, and it will take you more than 100 hours to see all of this game, because the scale of it is just breathtakingly huge. That's not to say that every one of those hours will be spent doing something worthwhile, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Every time you think you've got a handle on how big it's going to get, the game proves you wrong and shatters your expectations so hard your head will spin, and it's in the design of its world that Elden Ring excels and impresses more than anywhere else. I may have my fair share of problems with the game, but it's nevertheless an amazing achievement deserving of the huge success it's had. And yet, remember 10 years ago when every other game wanted to be like Dark Souls? Well, now Dark Souls wants to be like every other game. Elden Ring has the open world, it has the crafting system, it has the rudimentary stealth tacked on, it even has the repetitive copied and pasted content that so many other AAA games have made ubiquitous. We're lucky it doesn't have climbable towers for unlocking regions of the map. Without a doubt, Elden Ring is the most marketable game FromSoft has ever made, and that's before you even add in the name recognition it gets from George R.R. Martin. It probably is the case that a lot of the new features added to Elden Ring are there for the sake of making the game appeal to a wider audience, which, if true, is a worrying development, and seeing FromSoft go down that road might be too much for my heart to bear, so I'm choosing to willfully ignore it. It's like Dark Souls but open world is a phrase you probably heard a lot in the long run-up to Elden Ring's release, but when you think about what that really means, it can start to look like a bit of a contradiction. The Souls series is about navigating your way through tightly designed encounters within deliberately placed corridors and spaces. How do you translate that kind of gameplay over to an open world you can ride a horse around? Elden Ring's answer to this question is to split the world in two, between the open world that stretches off in all directions and the closed, more traditional areas where you have to proceed on foot. These more directed areas are better than they've ever been in a Souls game, but unfortunately the open world is constantly stepping on their toes in multiple ways that I'll get into later, and I'm not entirely convinced that the experiment was a success. Of course, one thing that Elden Ring has over other open world games is a tried and tested combat system that FromSoft has been coasting on for over 10 years. It's as good now as it was then, but I can't hide my disappointment that there's nothing really new about the game's combat. I hope that Elden Ring was an attempt at seeing the conventions of this series off with a bang, but the ridiculous success of the game might have thrown a $sign-shaped spanner into the works of that plan. If Elden Ring really is a swan song for the series, then I can forgive a lot of its flaws and enjoy it for what it does well, but if it's a sign of things to come, then the series is only one game away from becoming stagnant. It's possible to have too much of a good thing, and Elden Ring proves that in more ways than one, as I hope to show with this video. I might come across as overly harsh or negative at some points, so let me just repeat that I think Elden Ring is a great game. I enjoyed the time I spent with it, over 150 hours, and I seriously doubt any other game that comes out in the near future will be able to hold my attention for that long. But I think anyone who's played it will agree that it's by no means a perfect game, and in criticising it I'm trying to contribute in my own way to the discussion about why people enjoy this kind of game and where it could be improved. Naturally, you're allowed to disagree with my thoughts on the matter, and I welcome anyone to tell me in the comments why I'm wrong and stupid. For the sake of ease, I'm going to refer to Elden Ring as if it's in the same series as Dark Souls, because, come on, it is. Since the open world is the feature that's new to this series, and the one with the potential to shake things up the most, that's where I'll start. Spoilers from here. Souls games have always been about exploration. They've always encouraged the player to check every nook and cranny of each area to grab all the items and see everything they could before moving on, and Elden Ring delivers on this concept in an unprecedentedly ambitious way. It's not only about exploration, but freedom. The game's open world naturally means that you can go in any direction and explore things in whichever order you choose, but its major departure from previous Souls games is that almost everything is optional and can be ignored. If you were having trouble with an area in Dark Souls, you could go and progress elsewhere for a while, but you would always have to come back eventually. If you're struggling with a boss or dungeon in Elden Ring, you can teleport to the other side of the map and do something else, and for the most part it's up to you if you ever come back. I have a few thoughts about the vast majority of the game being skippable or optional, but before I get into my criticisms of the open world, I want to talk about the ways in which it succeeds. Elden Ring's open world is broken up into distinct regions, which are mostly discovered in a predefined order, except for Caelid, which can be reached from Limgrave at pretty much any point. In the first half of the game, Elden Ring's philosophy of player freedom shows itself in the amount of choice you have in getting between those regions. You can completely skip Stormveil Castle by going around it to get to Liurnia quickly, and there are no less than 3 different ways of reaching the Altus Plateau from Liurnia. After you clear the capital and get into the endgame, things get a bit more linear though, as the regions you explore after that are self-contained and less interconnected. In most regions, verticality is used to give some semblance of order to how you get around. Caria Manor in the northwest of Liurnia is on top of a cliff with only one way to get up there, so the player is funneled through that bottleneck if they want to reach the manor. The same is true of the village of Frenzied Flame, which is also on top of a cliff that can only be reached by one path guarded by a Tower of Madness. Mount Gelmir has only one way up it, accessed by this bridge, and once you're over that bridge you're on a linear path to the end of the area, kept in check by the high cliff faces around you. All of this has the effect of subtly encouraging you to do things in a certain order. The base of the hill leading to the village of Frenzied Flame is right next to the Grand Lift at the northern tip of Liurnia, so it will almost certainly be one of the last places you visit in this region. The entrance to Raya Lucaria Academy, on the other hand, is likely to be one of the first places you see in Liurnia, thanks to the fact that multiple teleporters around the region will send you straight to the door, where you'll find the map showing you where to get the key needed to enter. I do think it's kind of boring that the information telling you how to get through the door is found immediately next to the door, but I assume this was done for the sake of making sure that every player knew what their main goal was in the region. Still, I think the game could have benefited here from holding the player's hand a little less tightly. Likewise, there's a ghost NPC at the foot of the Grand Lift of Dectus who straight up tells you about the alternative route through the ravine, robbing the player of the satisfaction of finding it for themselves. These ghost NPCs are the only ones I can recall that don't have voice acting attached, so I'm guessing they were a late addition to the game. Merchants can sell you hints about enemy weak spots or instructions for how to reach certain areas, but it's nothing a thorough player wouldn't find on their own anyway. These purchasable hints feel like a missed opportunity, as they could have led to environmental puzzles or clues about illusory walls, but that's a minor complaint. All in all, the way the player is guided around the overworld is fairly unobtrusive, and while I was initially irritated by the guidance of grace that appears on the map screen, I stopped noticing it after a while and was able to happily ignore it for most of my playthrough. Actually, travelling through the overworld has been made as seamless as possible by some great quality of life features. For instance, the fact that stamina doesn't drain out of combat means you can get where you want to go at full speed without constantly stopping or slowing down. In my favourite example of a time-saving feature, summoning the horse makes it just appear underneath you, which I'm sure saves a huge amount of time over a full playthrough. I shudder to think how long I must have spent in The Witcher 3, whistling for my horse, looking around to find him, then walking over to him and mounting up, and often I would just run to places on foot because I didn't want to go through all that effort. Is there really a scenario in that game where you would want to call your horse and not get on it? Elden Ring wisely realises that this is all a waste of time and cuts it out entirely, and whether you want to ride the horse for 10 seconds or 10 minutes, it's always worth it to jump on. It's evident that some thought was put into allowing the player to explore the open world with as few interruptions as possible. When in the overworld, you can get charges back for your healing and magic flasks by killing scarabs or groups of enemies, which saves you from having to go back to a site of grace. You can also see that an effort was made to increase the likelihood that the player would find certain points of interest. Every catacomb has one of these statues pointing towards it, usually from a high spot that can be seen from a distance, which drastically improves your chances of finding these mini dungeons. Similarly, these walking spirits can lead you to landmarks if you find and interact with their candlestick. Once you've visited an area and touched a site of grace there, you can teleport back at any time, even from inside closed areas like Stormveil Castle or Raya Lucaria. All of these features are concessions that show FromSoft was thinking about little conveniences when it came to exploration, and clearly they wanted to make traversing the world as effortless as possible. Now, with all that said, let me ask you this. Do you want exploration to be this effortless in a FromSoft game? In Elden Ring, you never really feel like you're in danger when you're exploring the overworld. Being able to teleport to safety at any time means that exploring is less bravely venturing into the unknown and more studiously crossing items off a list. Traversing the overworld doesn't feel like surviving, and because enemy camps can be approached from whichever direction you choose, they don't feel like tightly designed challenges. Every time you engage with a group of enemies, it's on your terms, and you'll never find yourself in a fight or die scenario because every enemy group can be easily avoided by riding around. Or fuck it, don't even bother going around, just ride right on through and grab all the loot while you're at it. That's fine too. There's an example from the early game that shows the best and worst of the open world's potential in Elden Ring. Being transported to the Celia crystal mine by a trap chest in Limgrave is easily one of the highlights of the game's beginning, as it sends you far away to a dangerous area and forces you to find a way to escape. The only time you can't teleport is when you're inside a cave, mine or catacomb with an undefeated boss, meaning you have to make your way out of here on foot past enemies that you're almost certainly underleveled for. Once you find your way out, you're greeted not with the peaceful greenery of Limgrave, but with the pestilent landscape of Caelid, beset with decay and roamed by giant enemies spewing noxious clouds of rot. This is a truly impressive sight on a first playthrough, and I have to admit it's pretty intimidating to unexpectedly find yourself in such an alien environment. But since you're now out in the open and no longer in a mine, you can just teleport away immediately, and don't have to worry about Caelid until you come back on your own terms much later. And there's that phrase again, on your terms. Imagine how different this moment could have been if you weren't able to teleport away instantly, if this area wasn't something you could put down in your checklist to come back to later, but was something you had to come to terms with and conquer right now. You opened the chest and got yourself into this situation, now get yourself out. I realised that a change like this would require a massive overhaul to the way the game's fast travel works, and I'm not sure myself what the best solution would be here, but in its current state, I think the game lets you off way too easily. By allowing the player to do everything on their own terms, Elden Ring gives you too much freedom, and when you have too much freedom, there's no tension, no sense of danger. Here's another example. The approach to Castle Morn in any other Souls game would have been a struggle to avoid the giant archer's barrage head-on. In Elden Ring, you can just skirt around the edge of the map and get behind him with no risk at all of being shot. You have so much freedom here that you can easily trivialize what could have been an interesting scenario. This isn't a clever solution you can find by being observant or understanding the map layout, it's literally the first and most obvious thing that every player will think to do. For a counterpart to this, look at the similar setup in the narrow pass in the mountaintops of the Giants, where a more restrictive environment leads to a far more memorable encounter with the giant archer, or the Tower of Madness watching over the hill near the Grand Lift. In these scenarios you have less freedom, and they're all the more enjoyable and challenging for it. Let's keep going. Being able to completely ignore and run past bosses in the overworld is so underwhelming that I think it needs no explanation. Previous Souls games had optional bosses, but the difference there is that they were usually placed at the end of a gauntlet, with nothing behind them except a new weapon and bragging rights. In Elden Ring, there are bosses guarding important parts of the map that you can just ride straight past. When passing round the back of Mount Gelmir, there's a scripted sequence where a rune bear leaps towards you, half a ton of hefty beast bone that might have been intimidating if it wasn't for the fact that you can ride straight past and he'll just lie down and go to sleep. What the fuck? The pair of tree sentinels by the entrance to the capital can be ignored without much effort, which is just baffling to me considering that there's an alternative entrance you can use anyway. Why not have the sentinels guarding a locked gate that you need to beat them to get through, with the second entrance as a way for crafty players to avoid the fight by taking an alternate route? As it is now, there's nothing pushing you to fight these guys, and no penalty for riding straight through. If this isn't an example of the player having too much freedom, then I don't know what is. In fact, riding straight through bosses and enemies in the overworld is sort of incentivized by the game's map discovery system, and I have mixed feelings about the way it works. I'll start with the good stuff. Seeing the map screen actually grow in size every time you reach a new area is amazing, and watching the true size of the world unfurl before you is consistently impressive. When I found the chest that teleports you to the capital, a huge distance north of my current map, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It just didn't seem possible that the game could be this big. And then it just kept going and going, and there was a whole new region after the capital, an entire underground space half the size of the overworld, and then a gigantic optional area with even more after that. It would be remiss of me not to point out just how stunning the introduction to some of these areas can be. Coming to Farum Azula through one of the Belfry portals is a breathtaking holy shit moment, only slightly marred by the realization that you're only seeing a preview of a late game area. Descending down the Siofra River well is an awesome sight in the truest sense of the word, a minute-long ride downwards into a cavernous space lit by twinkling starlight, with crumbled ruins towering into the far distance. The soundtrack down here is perfectly eerie and otherworldly as well, especially when you enter combat. I was so intimidated by this area that when I first arrived, I touched the site of grace and promptly teleported out of there, and I imagine many other players did the same. Once again, I can't help but wonder if it would have made for a better experience if you were stuck down here without the ability to teleport away, at least for a while. It's a shame that Limgrave, Liurnia and the Altus Plateau are so samey, but on the whole there's an impressive amount of visual variety in Elden Ring. Anyway, back to the map. It only shows icons for places you've already visited, so you need to actually use it like a map and identify for yourself points of interest like ruins, tunnel entrances and bridges. You have a compass at the top of the screen, but it really is just a compass and isn't covered with annoying arrows pointing you to nearby locations, although you can place your own markers on it if you want to. When you first get to a new region, your map will be completely blank, but after a bit of exploration you'll eventually see a lantern icon, which tells you where to find the map item for the area, and picking up this item fills in the map for that region. This is why I said you're incentivized to dash past bosses and enemies on your first pass through an area. Exploring with a filled-in map is so much easier, and the game tells you exactly where to go to get it, so why wouldn't you go there first? Perhaps the most egregious area for this is Mount Gelmir, which is one of the more linear areas in the game, with the map item located at the very end of the path. This means you'll want to ride past everything, activating every site of grace on the way, passing straight by any bosses until you get to the map item, after which you can go back checkpoint by checkpoint and clear out all the content you skipped on the way. As I said before, once you get to this point you're no longer exploring and surviving in a dangerous world, you're just checking locations off a list. This problem could have been alleviated by just not having the lantern on the map screen, which actually is the case in the underground areas. You can still find map items down here, you just don't know where they are until you stumble into one, and it's no coincidence that these areas are some of the most foreboding in the game. Gripes about the map lanterns aside, Elden Ring is more willing than the average game to let the player navigate for themselves, and as a result it's overwhelmingly likely that you'll miss a few caves or dungeons on your way to the end of the game. This isn't a bad thing, and it means there will probably be plenty of discoveries left for your second playthrough. With almost every bit of content in the game being optional, you could make a strong case for the argument that you're not supposed to see everything in one playthrough. You don't even need to defeat all of the main Shardbearer bosses to reach the endgame. Certain overworld bosses like the Deathbirds and Knight's Cavalry only appear at night and are completely absent during the daytime, so there's simply no way any single player could see everything by themselves. Also, side note, but if you die to one of these bosses then you get sent back to a site of grace and the time reverts back to morning, so you have to rest and pass time again until it's night if you want another try at the boss. This is such an annoying oversight that I'm hoping it gets patched out and this little aside becomes an irrelevant waste of time in an already lengthy video. Thanks for watching, by the way. And speaking of patches, I completely missed his hideaway in Limgrave on my first playthrough, and only came back to find it much later after a friend clued me in that he was in the game. I likewise missed the Crystal Cave under Raya Lucaria and the Writhe Blood Ruins in the Altus Plateau, and it wasn't until my second playthrough that I discovered the secret area under Stormveil Castle with the Godskin face from the trailer. I actually still have no idea where this lift near one of the checkpoints in the castle leads to, and I'm certain there are many more secret spots that I never found. Despite that, I don't feel like I missed out by accidentally bypassing these areas in my original playthrough, and there are two reasons for that, both related to the rewards Elden Ring gives you for exploring and completing dungeons. Naturally, first and foremost, there's the intrinsic satisfaction of beating a challenging dungeon or a difficult boss, and it's this rewarding feeling that the entire Souls series exists to cultivate. I strongly doubt any player could get very far in one of these games if they weren't driven at least in part by this intrinsic motivation. On top of that though, you're also usually given extrinsic rewards in the form of weapons, armor sets, spells, ashes for summoning, resources for upgrading equipment, and plenty of runes to level up your character and increase your stats. Because of character specialization, a lot of items you get as a reward for beating challenges, perhaps even the majority of them, will be useless to you. Spells, for instance, were no good to me as a strength-based character without the stats to cast them. Some effort was made to alleviate this, as Physic Tears, Ashes of War and Summoning Ashes can be used by most builds and characters, making them an easy prize to put in a chest or at the end of a dungeon. But even then I found myself barely experimenting with these features because there was usually only one clear way to maximize the efficiency of my strength build, and even if I wanted to use summons, I didn't have enough FP to cast most of them. You might say this is on me for being narrow-minded and refusing to explore the different options the game was giving me, but I don't think I'm solely to blame here. In previous Souls games, many items given as a reward were useless to you if you were already focused on a certain build for your character, but it wasn't a big problem there because most bosses had an additional extrinsic motivation to fighting them, namely that by defeating them, you were able to go past them and into the next part of the game. This was a simple but extremely effective carrot to dangle in front of the player, but because everything in Elden Ring is optional, that trick is almost never applicable, and it's another way that the amount of freedom given to the player hurts the experience. Okay, so the extrinsic rewards you get for beating challenges might not always be worth it, but at least the game has its good old intrinsic reward to fall back on, right? Well, for the most part, yes, and for the first half of my playthrough I was always excited to see what was behind every corner or at the end of every dungeon. I realised early on that the chest at the top of each magic rise contained an extra memory slot for spells, which was of course useless to me, but I continued to complete the puzzle to get into each one anyway because I enjoyed the unique challenges. About halfway through the game, however, I started to see repeated bosses, and began to get a bit tired of exploring the same catacomb and jumping down the exact same mineshaft in a dozen places around the map. I know this is mostly due to bad luck, but when I happened to do a few catacombs back to back that had a tree spirit boss fight at the end of them, I wasn't particularly thrilled about fighting the same boss all over again, and just left to come back later when I wasn't bored by the idea. There are one or two rematch fights that actually introduce something new, but I would have been equally happy if I only fought the boss once, and a second phase introduced the new changes. The most disappointing example of reused bosses for me was in the Everjail fights, which I first assumed would each be unique. I'm no lore master, but it seemed like each of these Everjails was a prison made to seal someone away for a heinous crime, and it got my imagination fired up to think about what the Crucible Knight or Bloodhound Knight Darrowil could have done to get locked up for all eternity. Picture my disappointment then when I ran into another Bloodhound Knight in a random cave, and then another one just clinging to a wall in the overworld. This is a subjective complaint and your mileage may vary, especially if you encountered these enemies and bosses in a different order to me, but seeing them repeated elsewhere took away from the importance I'd attributed to my fights with the Everjail prisoners. Still, at least they don't reuse any of the main story bosses. Oh wait, they do. This brawl with Godfroy the Grafted really soured me on the repeated boss fights in the game, and even when I encountered a boss I hadn't seen before, I found myself wondering how long it would be before the game threw them at me again. With so much of the game being optional, it's absolutely possible to miss or intentionally skip huge parts of the game and still reach the ending having had a satisfying experience, and I'm curious whether that fact emboldened FromSoft to reuse content as much as they did in Elden Ring. If so, then it's further evidence for the idea that you're not really supposed to do everything in one playthrough. For some people, the fact that all of this content is optional will make the game bulletproof to my criticism of it. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it, I can hear them crying now. Well, there are multiple reasons I don't agree with that. First of all, you don't know which boss will be waiting in an Everjail or at the end of a dungeon until you get there. For all you know, it could be something new, so you have to go and check, and if you choose not to fight the boss at that point because you're disappointed to find that it's been reused, then it's already too late. Secondly, above all else, I, like many others, enjoy playing this kind of game for the intrinsic reward of beating it, and if the game becomes repetitive enough to stop being intrinsically rewarding to play, that's a big problem. Third, you can't forget that there still is that extrinsic reward to fighting bosses and clearing dungeons, if not always in the form of useful gear, then at least in the form of runes, which you need for leveling and upgrading. Since you never know what reward you'll get from a boss or dungeon, you still have a practical incentive to defeat them even if it's an enemy type you're sick of seeing. Basically, the argument that it's optional so just ignore it doesn't really fly, and telling me that I'll enjoy the game more if I ignore half of it isn't the slam dunk some people seem to think it is. When it comes down to it, the further you get into the game and the more repeated content you see, the more you might start questioning if the world is too big. I would have been quite happy with a world half the size that didn't have to repeat the same bosses, caves, mines and catacombs as often. It's hard to get too annoyed about being able to run straight past bosses like the Tree Sentinels, the Falling Star Beast, or every dragon in the overworld when you've already fought and beaten exact copies of them elsewhere. All of this is why I feel fine in saying that I didn't really miss out when I unwittingly passed straight by this cave in Caelid, or failed to notice this route that serves as a bridge to a hole in the cliffside. Whatever it is that's at the bottom of this lift shaft, it's probably nothing I haven't seen before. 10 times. There's one part of Elden Ring's easily skippable content that you will feel like you missed out on though, and that's the side quests. While the extrinsic rewards you get from these quests, like weapons and spells and so on, suffer from the same problems of utility as elsewhere in the game, the intrinsic reward of helping a character and seeing them follow their own journey alongside yours is inherently satisfying and has always been a part of the series. Sadly, the enormous size of Elden Ring's world and the freedom you have to explore it in whichever order you like means that it's ridiculously easy to miss out on the majority of quests in the game. Let's take Lightseeker Hyetta as an example. You need to find her at certain spots in Liurnia and give her a Shiburi grape each time to help her move along to the next one. If you don't have one when you first meet her, however, you're likely to do quite a lot of exploring before coming across one and taking it back to her starting location. If, in the intervening time, you've already passed through and fully explored the area where she appears next, you're incredibly unlikely to run into her again unless you have a habit of riding through regions of the map you've already finished with, and there's absolutely no reason to do that when you can just teleport around via Sites of Grace. This is exactly what happened to me on my first playthrough. I handed her my hard-earned grape at the Site of Grace behind Stormvale, and then never saw her again. That's what I get for simping. Millicent's questline is even worse for this because you need to speak to her in multiple specific places all over the world map. When Corrin leaves the Round Table Hold, he moves next to the map lantern thing in the Altus Plateau, which I think implies that you're supposed to run into him here. If you dare to do things in the wrong order though, you can grab the map item before Corrin moves here, and have absolutely no reason to pass through again and see him. Clearly FromSoft noticed this problem internally and gave it a rethink, because the game's first major patch added markers on the map to show each NPC's location, an imperfect solution that doesn't really solve the problem and only spoils the elegance of the map. By far the most frustrating example of nearly missed content for me was the entrance to Nokron that opens after killing Radahn. When I'd all but reached the end of the game, I knew I must have missed something because I still hadn't found a way into the city. Turns out that after beating Radahn you can go back to the Mistwood in Limgrave and jump down this new hole. This isn't like one of those inconsequential caves you can skip without appreciably changing your impression of the game. A sizable chunk of the experience requires you to go down here, so this is one case where you really don't want to miss out. But just like most side quests, it's yet another instance where the game requires you to go back through a previously explored area to progress, something you ordinarily have no reason to do. Why would I spend time traversing through old areas on the off chance I might run into something new? I'll concede that the game does give you the clues needed to figure out where to go, but can you really blame me for missing it when I encountered those clues 50 hours apart from each other? I might be the outlier in this, and if everyone disagrees with me I'm willing to say I wasn't paying enough attention, but I think it could have been made just a little bit clearer. I'm actually not finished complaining about the overworld and its amount of reused side content yet, because there's a debilitating, borderline game-breaking issue that emerges from its preponderance in the mid-game, but I'll hold that back for the second half of this video for reasons that will become apparent. Before I wrap up this first half, I have a few stray thoughts that didn't really fit in elsewhere. As a new addition to the series, I feel like I should bring up the crafting system, but there's not a whole lot to say. Every consumable you can craft is also obtainable as a regular item drop in the world, so if you use consumables as sparingly as I do, you can probably go the entire game without crafting anything. Despite that, I spent the entire game fervently picking up every crafting material I saw in the overworld, so when I did want to craft some extra fire enhancements just to be sure I had enough, I was more than prepared. The crafting feels a little bit tacked on, and there aren't really any interesting choices involved in using it, but the different materials at least succeed in adding a bit of flavour to each of the world's different areas. Sometimes the map is wrong, but rarely in a way that's interesting or challenging. It could have made for an engaging scenario if a bridge you were expecting to be somewhere collapsed and you had to improvise a different path. Now that I think about it, a mechanic where your map is out of date and you have to adapt to something you weren't prepared for sounds really compelling, but the overwhelming majority of the time the map can be trusted, so I'm not really sure what they were going for with this. Maybe the world design team missed a meeting with the map team. The bats that roam around at night actually go somewhere to sleep during the daytime. I love this. It might have been an interesting twist to have some of the nighttime bosses hide away somewhere discoverable during the day as well. The day-night cycle in Elden Ring is pretty underutilized, to be honest, and with the amount of ambient light that covers the overworld, you'll probably have to open the map and check just to be sure what time of day it's supposed to be. As in previous games, killing main bosses rewards you with a soul item that can be either used for a big payout or traded for a powerful weapon or spell. Unlike previous games, however, you don't need to worry about carefully choosing what weapons or equipment you choose to buy with boss souls, since you can clone them at the walking mausoleums. This means that you're able to get more out of one playthrough and aren't locked into any choices you make, at least with regard to these soul items. This is another instance of the game giving you so much freedom that you're robbed of a potentially interesting choice to make, with a tedious trip to a mausoleum and back to sweeten the deal. Should you trade that boss soul for a powerful spell or a powerful weapon? Who cares, just get both. Which brings me back to the overarching idea I just can't shake, and gives me a great excuse to name drop the title of the video. Elden Ring gives the player too much of a good thing. Back in the intro I said I wasn't entirely sure if the open world was a successful experiment, and this is the reason. On the face of it, more freedom seems like an obvious benefit, right? Having to make choices to solve problems is one of the things that makes games fun, so surely infinite freedom in how you solve these problems is a winning combination that pushes that dial as far as it can go. The stable of perfect reviews Elden Ring has earned for itself says yes, but I don't think it's quite true. Yes, Elden Ring gives you a huge variety of options for how to deal with a problem, but it also gives you the option of ignoring the problem altogether. A boring solution, but an undeniably effective one that's actively incentivized at times. You can teleport yourself away from danger in an instant. You can ride through every overworld boss and ignore them completely. You can get both of the potential rewards from trading in a boss's soul. Encounters or choices that had the potential to be interesting are trivialized or even removed entirely at the player's discretion. This is the danger of giving the player the freedom to do everything on their own terms. They won't really be challenged by anything unless they choose to be, and a self-imposed challenge is a challenge in spite of a game's design, not because of it. A certain amount of freedom is great, but when you're given too much, you're being handed the power to ruin the experience for yourself, and you almost certainly will. Elden Ring's open world is a great spectacle that's truly impressive at times, but the fact that almost all of it can be completely ignored means that after a point, you might start to ask yourself what it's all for, what it really brings to the table. In the early hours of the game, when everything is still new, the scale of the world makes it feel like anything could be possible, but you'll see right through that illusion the instant you encounter your first repeated boss. I enjoyed my first fight against an ulcerated tree spirit, not so much the 7th and 8th. It's only natural that the majority of the game's polish was devoted to the mandatory, or at least the more major parts of the world that every player is likely to explore, and the content in these areas is, generally speaking, excellent. Unfortunately, the vast majority of your time with Elden Ring won't be spent in the impressively designed closed areas like the Royal Capital or the Halig Tree. It will be spent in these cramped, indistinguishable dungeons that reuse the same bosses and the same mechanics, or in the overworld travelling between them and fighting a different set of repeated bosses. When you start rolling your eyes at the sight of your 10th Erd Tree avatar, you know you've had too much of a good thing. Okay, so by now you've probably picked up on the fact that I'm not really sold on Elden Ring's open world. In terms of scale, spectacle and visuals, it's a great achievement, but when it comes down to the mechanical, game design consequences of it, I'm not sure it brings enough meaningful positives to the experience. Thankfully, in the design of the game's interior regions, FromSoft has raised the bar so high I'm not sure how they can ever top it. In previous Souls entries, the level design tended to be fairly linear. That's not to say there weren't plenty of red herrings and side paths that led to items, enemies and traps, but what I mean by linear is that there was only one correct path forward. It's just that you didn't know which route led the way forward, so you would likely explore a lot of space that was technically optional while hunting for the right path. In keeping with the theme of player choice and freedom established in the overworld, some of the most interesting closed areas in Elden Ring are huge interconnected spaces with multiple viable routes to the boss door at the end, and a higher level of complexity than I've ever seen in one of these games. Stormvale Castle is an incredibly strong opener, and the route you take through it has multiple branching points. You can reach Godric at the end after only seeing about half the castle if you're so inclined. Rather than following a set path like in previous games, you really feel like you're navigating a complex space with no single correct way through. Right from the get-go, you're given the choice of opening the gate and going straight into the courtyard, or scaling the outside wall. If you do climb the wall, then you soon get another choice between proceeding along the ramparts or going even higher to explore the rooftops, where there are yet more ways forward to choose from. At almost any point you have the option of dropping down to a lower level, and it's this vertical nature that makes the design feel so open-ended and satisfying to explore. Whenever you do drop down to a lower level, you're locked into that pathway at least for a little while before you find a way back up, which usually leads to a moment of, "Oh, I'm back here." I didn't feel like I was following a path through Stormvale, I felt like I was making one. And if freedom was their goal, then that's probably the highest compliment I could give to the level designers at FromSoft. I had a similar experience making my way through the capital, surely one of the biggest and most sprawling urban areas that's ever been in one of these games, but the clearest expression of this new level design philosophy can be seen at the base of the Halig tree, where the doorway at the end can be reached by 3 separate and crisscrossing routes. Volcano Manor gets a special mention here, for having a pretty good design that loops back around on itself, and then completely copping out at the end by just having a portal that takes you to the boss room. This is just laughably cheap, and I hope it's only here because FromSoft ran out of time and not out of imagination. The shaded castle on the Altus Plateau is the only closed area I can recall that has multiple entrances to find, which is a great use of the open world that I would have liked to see more of. Caria Manor is a bottleneck that closes off an area of the map for the sake of Ranni's side quest, so it makes sense that it has a singular entrance and exit. But was there any reason for that to be the case with Stormvale Castle or Raya Lucaria? A secret path into one of these areas, maybe through an underground passage, could have been a great reward for observant players. This seems like such an obvious way of integrating the open world with the closed areas, but it's barely done at all and it's seriously missed potential. Another problem I noticed in Shaded Castle is that unlockable shortcuts are largely useless in Elden Ring, and the blame for this falls squarely at the feet of the game's new respawn mechanic. If you die fighting a boss, you usually have the choice between going back to the last checkpoint or spawning next to a stake of Marika, which is more often than not right next to the boss room. I can only recall a handful of bosses that made me run past enemies to retry them. Thanks to these stakes of Marika, the boss runs of previous games are a thing of the past. I'm not too broken up about this because running past a horde of enemies to get back to the boss didn't always add a lot to the experience in Dark Souls, but I do think something was lost by making shortcuts such a waste of time. Unlocking a faster way of travelling through a level was a rewarding part of exploration in past games, but in Elden Ring you might as well not bother. I bet most players kick down this ladder near the end of Shaded Castle and never actually need to climb up it. I've spoken already about the repetitive nature of the caves, mines and catacombs in Elden Ring, but I'll give a quick word on their actual design. Most catacombs are based around false paths that look like the way forward, only to lead to a dead end, forcing you to double back and take a closer look for a less obvious path. This gets old very quickly, and the copied and pasted rooms, staircases, traps and lifts are hardly memorable the first time round, never mind the 10th. They get a breath of fresh air from the Holy Circle mechanic that's introduced halfway through the game, bringing some light puzzle elements that were sorely needed, but it's nowhere near enough to offset the fatigue a player will feel if they try doing 2 of these catacombs in a row. I actually really enjoyed the first chariot dungeon I came across. Navigating around an insta-kill trap with high stakes was a unique part of the game for me at that point, but as is always the case when the game requires patience before you can act, doing it over and over again is not just boring, it's frustrating and starts to feel like a waste of time. The caves at least finally live up to the promise made by Dark Souls 2 by actually requiring you to bring a light source with you if you want to see. You can use spells, a tool on your belt, or a torch, each with their own benefits and trade-offs, which makes it a nice example of the player having the freedom to solve a problem using many different options, without one of those options invalidating the others. It also serves as an overly contrived segue so that I can start talking about another system based on an intricate balance of options and trade-offs. Combat. It's the bread and butter of this series, and it's what you spend the majority of your time doing and preparing for. But if you've played any FromSoft game in the last 10 years, Sekiro excluded, then you already know pretty much exactly how it works. Elden Ring's combat mechanics are mostly unchanged from past games, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, here's a lightning quick rundown of what I think are the core elements of that now classic formula. The player's given choices with a balance between risk and reward for both offensive and defensive situations. When defending, you can block, dodge, or parry, each option being riskier than the last, with a greater penalty for failure but a greater reward if you can pull it off. When attacking, you can choose between light, heavy, and charge attacks that progressively deal more damage, use more stamina, and have a longer wind-up and recovery time, leaving you vulnerable for longer. Since stamina is used for both offensive and defensive moves, managing it effectively to avoid enemy attacks while maximizing the damage you deal yourself is one of the core hooks of the series. When you mess up and take damage, one mistake usually doesn't kill you, but 2 or 3 in a row does. You need to carefully choose your moment to heal and restore your mistake threshold, since you're vulnerable while taking a sippy. Healing is limited by your number of flask charges. These come back if you die or choose to rest at a site of grace, both of which also cause all the area's enemies to respawn. This means there's a long-term hard limit on how much damage you can take before you run out of healing and have to choose between pressing on or retreating back to your last checkpoint to rest, which creates a sense of tension when you're exploring an area for the first time and unaware of how close the next checkpoint is. This is another mechanic that's at the very core of the series. There's more to it than this, but those are the basics that every player needs to understand to get started. The basis of Elden Ring's combat system is strong, but in all likelihood you knew that already. It's fundamentally the same one that FromSoft has been using for over a decade now, which I can't help but find disappointing after seeing how original they could be with Sekiro. I have to let this go because, at the end of the day, they keep using it because it's so damn good, and it's in the other areas of Elden Ring that they were really pushing themselves. But this is the last time they get a free pass. This stamina-based combat system has run its course, and they desperately need to do something new in their next game. Dare I say it so early into this half of the video, we've had too much of a good thing with these combat mechanics. To its credit, Elden Ring does have a few minor differences from previous Souls games that can slightly change how you approach fights. It's just that none of it feels particularly new or groundbreaking, and in some cases actually interferes with the delicate risk-reward balance that's so core to the series. Let's start with stealth, which allows you to crouch and sneak up on or sneak past enemies. I think the idea is to make it easier to get in close for backstabs, but this whole stealth system is underdeveloped and becomes largely irrelevant in the open world once you have the horse, whose agility and speed make stealth pointless. There's little point wasting time sneaking when you can just charge straight past a camp of enemies on horseback. There is the odd moment when sneaking comes in handy in the game's closed areas, but for the most part it doesn't have a lot of utility. I also find it surprising that every class of character is capable of sneaking like this, because it just looks kind of silly to see someone in full armor crouching and tiptoeing around silently. If stealth attacks had a bigger damage boost but were only available if you were under a certain equipment load, then it might have led to some interesting character specialization. But a huge number of enemy encounters in the game can only be approached from one direction, where stealth isn't an option anyway. Overall, the ability to crouch was a strange inclusion to Elden Ring that doesn't add a whole lot to the game. The same can't be said for the introduction of jump attacks, made possible by the fact that Elden Ring has a jump button. At first, these attacks seemed like a nice addition to the player's moveset that gives them more options, but as I got further into the game, I started to realize how exploitable they are. As I mentioned earlier, the essence of Souls combat is centered around trade-offs of risk and reward, with high damage moves generally having long wind-up times that make you vulnerable, forcing you to choose your moments carefully. Jumping attacks in Elden Ring completely break this balancing act, as they can be executed instantly from a running jump for high damage, and don't need the player to put themselves in danger to pull off. Add to this the fact that jump attacks are usually strong enough to cause enemies to stagger, giving you plenty of time to get away or queue up another attack, and you have a consistent recipe for cheese that can steamroll most enemies in the mid-game with very little risk to you. This kind of plunging attack used to be a rare thing in previous Souls games, a reward to players making use of the environment in a clever way. In Onion Ring, you can do it every time you hit the attack button, and if you're playing a strength build, then you probably will. As with crouching, this seems at first like a case where it might have made sense to limit jumping to a certain equipment load, similarly to how rolling changes depending on the weight of your gear. Unfortunately, because jumping is also used for platforming and exploration, there's no way this could have worked. Players wearing heavier armor would have been constantly opening the menu to get naked and do some platforming before getting dressed again. For the sake of the game's sense of exploration then, the fact that every character can jump is a good thing. For the sake of combat, however, it makes for an overpowered and easily exploitable move that trivializes a lot of enemy encounters. There are a couple of ways this could have been avoided, the most obvious being to tone down the damage, or at least the staggering effect of jumping attacks. Another solution might be to only allow jumping attacks when jumping from a certain height, which would preserve the reward of exploiting your environment to gain an advantage, without making jump attacks as OP as they are now. Guard counters, another new addition to Elden Ring, feel similarly out of step with the usual delicate balance of combat options, as they turn a defensive stance into an offensive one with an instant turnaround for high damage, with a fairly generous timing window to boot. When it comes to jumping attacks, I can see that the presence of a jump button and platforming made their inclusion inevitable, but with guard counters it really just feels like a needless addition at best, and at worst an overly exploitable move that encourages you to play in a boring, safe way. I almost get the impression that FromSoft grafted on a few extra mechanics because they knew they couldn't get away with using exactly the same combat as Dark Souls 3, but maybe I'm just salty that it feels like a step backwards from the originality of Sekiro. Most of the combat scenarios I've been showing so far have been the ones from the closed areas of the game. That's because in the overworld, combat often looks like this. Circling around enemies on torrent and slashing away is not only too easy, it's boring. Horseback combat is simultaneously too bare bones and too overpowered. Your moveset is hugely restricted and you don't get any iframes when you dash, but despite that, the ridiculous increase in mobility that comes from being on the horse can trivialize a lot of encounters. I don't think there's a single enemy in the game that can actually match the speed or agility of your horse. An attempt was made to balance this out by giving overworld bosses attacks that will throw you off your horse in one hit, leaving you splayed out on the floor and unable to roll away for a stupidly long time. But for the most part, the scales tip dramatically in your favor whenever you have access to torrent. You can see proof of this whenever you fight a boss on horseback that you previously had to do on foot. The Crucible Knight on the edge of Nokron is a joke when you can run circles around him on torrent. The OP horse also means that dragon bosses are a little underwhelming, and most of them end up looking practically the same but with a different colour scheme. Alright, so I've covered the player's side of combat, but how about the enemies? Most of the standard humanoid enemies can be easily stun-locked to death once you get close to them, even by a weak character like my second playthrough's mage, meaning that they only pose a threat if they surprise you, if they have ranged attacks, or if they come at you in a group. Sure enough, the most memorable encounters with this kind of enemy are all about positioning, crowd control, and prioritization. Even larger enemies can be a pushover if you're able to stagger them with your first attack, and it's only the ones with enough health to survive a full combo that are even able to carry out any attacks of their own. Throughout my first playthrough with the strength build, I often found that it was agile or flying enemies that gave me the most trouble, as a missed attack could cost me dearly, and the windows of time in which I could hit them with melee weapons were narrow. That just leaves us with enemies that are strong enough to avoid being interrupted by your attacks, a category mostly made up of bosses, and where combat in Elden Ring is by far at its most interesting. The traditional Souls boss usually comes at the end of a dungeon or area, where you pass through a fog gate and get locked in a room with them until one of you is dead. The tension that can build in these fights, and the relief when you finally come out victorious, is easily one of the high points of the Souls formula, and when things come together just right in Elden Ring, it can be a thing of beauty few games can match. So what makes a boss fight like this feel so good? Simply put, it's because they take some effort and dedication to beat. You need to invest time learning the timings of their attacks so that you can effectively avoid or dodge through damage, and you need to experiment to find the moments when the boss is most vulnerable to your own attacks. With enough practice, you'll eventually be able to deal and avoid enough damage to get the boss to 0 health before they do it to you. It really is as simple as that. Watching your skills improve as you get the boss's health lower and lower on each successive try is a really rewarding experience, and the longer it takes you to beat them, the higher the tension builds, and the better it feels when you win. Up to a certain point anyway. Many of the more climactic bosses have second phases that begin when you get them down to half health, which cranks the tension even further and stops you from getting too comfortable with a boss's moveset. One of my favourite and most memorable fights was with the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella, which I must have spent a good 90 minutes on before finally beating him, with a few close calls along the way. Learning which of his telegraphs led to which attack so that I could be out of the damage zone while I dished out punishment was really satisfying, as was identifying and avoiding his AoE ground attack. The transition into his second phase is a great escalation of challenge that tests you on your damage avoidance as he flies away to hurl bolts or dive at you. Commander Niall was another highlight of my first playthrough, as the rapid pace of his attacks really forced me to learn when to sneak in some damage in the middle of his combos. It's a fight that requires patience in a good way, because overreaching will be heavily punished. There's also an interesting choice for the player to make in terms of strategy, since Niall summons 2 soldiers at the start of the fight, and doesn't move into his second, more dangerous phase until either his summons are dead or he's down to half health, whichever happens first. This gives the player a choice between keeping a soldier alive and focusing on Niall to have an easier second phase, or getting rid of the soldiers so that there's only one target to focus on, albeit a more powerful one. In a series where boss fights against multiple enemies can be pretty controversial, I'd point to this as an example of the idea done right. The enemies are distinct in their movesets and behaviours, so there are multiple viable strategies for dealing with the situation. I have similarly positive thoughts on the fight against the Beastman duo, where one throws projectiles and the other uses a sword. The fact that each Beastman has a different moveset can be used against them, as you can bait away the melee one and quickly focus down the ranged attacker to equalise the playing field. Not all boss fights against multiple opponents are as fairly balanced as this, however, and if you finish the game yourself, then you're probably already picturing the Godskin duo. These flappy fellas are as frustrating an example of a multi-enemy boss as you're likely to find in any Souls game. Because they have similar movesets and behaviours, they're both constantly advancing towards the player, making it difficult to isolate one to get some hits in, unless you exploit the arena layout and bait them around one of the pillars. Whereas the fight with Commander Niall requires patience in a way that feels rewarding, this fight against the Foreskin duo requires patience in the worst possible way, because opportunities to deal damage safely are few and far between, and it just feels like the game is wasting your time with the poorly thought out encounter. And that's not even the biggest slap in the face of the player that occurs during this fight. When you take out one of the duo by smacking it right in his Skinner box, the other one will continue to fight you solo for a bit before summoning another partner with a unique animation. It's only natural for a player to assume here that this animation is what causes the partner to arrive, and that by taking out the second Godskinner before he's able to summon would end the fight early, a reward for beating both members of the duo in quick succession. But no, that's not what happens. Even if you manage to kill them before they can summon, another Godskin bastard will still appear to ruin your day and make this torturous fight even longer. Another fight against multiple bosses that I think is already infamous is the trio of Crystalians. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the Crystalian Spearman is probably one of the worst enemies I've ever encountered in one of these games, and fighting him alongside 2 other bosses is excruciating. If he just had a different moveset, I think this fight had a lot of potential to be really enjoyable, like an upgraded version of the Beastman duo I've already praised. As it is, I know that he technically has 2 or 3 attacks he can do, but the one that it feels like he's constantly spamming is this. It's not that this is particularly hard to dodge, it's that it's boring. It makes for long stretches of time where he's not a viable target, and because he's homing in on you with his 100 poke combo, neither are the other members of the trio. Once again, it takes an extreme amount of the bad kind of patience to fight this Crystal Team Rocket with any kind of consistency. People have been rightly complaining about these multi-boss encounters since Dark Souls 2, and it's insane that FromSoft is still doing it to us 8 years later. There's no way they aren't aware that tedious fights like this piss people off, and I'm left to conclude that FromSoft is trying to encourage, if not outright force you to use Spirit Ash summons for these fights, which means it's almost time to fat roll headfirst into the endless discussion about difficulty in these games. Of course I'll be ending that debate once and for all in this video, but for now I'll ease us in gently by bringing up an issue in the mid-game I hinted at earlier. There's a problem that emerges in any open world game that allows you to level up your skills and damage output. If the stats of enemies are static and don't change, then you might trivialize some encounters by leveling up too much. Some RPGs try to address this by having enemies in the world level alongside you, and by the time you reach the end, every bandit you run into will be wearing the best armor in the game. On the one hand, this means the developers can guarantee the player encounters a roughly equal difficulty across the game. But on the other hand, it means the player feels next to no sense of progression. It's a messy solution that I think most people would agree doesn't work. In Elden Ring, there's no such world leveling. When you improve your character and your weapons, that's a permanent advantage you now have over the world, but this brings with it its own problems. If you like to be thorough and explore all of the optional content before tackling the main path, then you'll get so many resources that you end up comically overleveled and beating a lot of mid-game bosses on your first try. Beating a boss because your number is higher than their number doesn't feel particularly rewarding because you don't have to commit yourself to learning anything. If you're underleveled for a boss, then you have a near limitless amount of choice in how to level up, respec or re-equip your character to come back and try again later. If you're over-leveled for a boss, then you've unwittingly ruined the fight for yourself with no way to undo it. There's a sweet spot in terms of damage output and healing potential that will make for the most enjoyable fight with each boss, but because you have the freedom to discover and fight them in any order you like, it's down to pure chance whether you're approaching the boss with stats that will make for an enjoyable fight or a boring cakewalk, and you don't know which one it's going to be until you land that first hit. That fight I enjoyed so much with the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella only happened because of random chance. If I'd come down here a few hours later and 15 levels higher, everything that made this encounter so well balanced for me would have been different, and I probably wouldn't be talking about it right now. I'd wager that most players have a different favourite boss from the mid-game, and that it mostly comes down to whether they were in that sweet spot for stats and equipment when they fought them. For the same reason, of the dozens of bosses I've fought in this game, I don't have that much to say about them individually. Does Godric have an interesting moveset that makes for an engaging fight? I have no idea, I beat him on my first try. By the time I got around to fighting him, I had enough healing flasks to eat all of his damage and win without really committing myself, a hollow victory. This is an issue directly caused by the non-linear open world structure of the first 2/3 of the game, and once again it's an example of Elden Ring giving you too much freedom and allowing you to ruin the experience for yourself. I think this is proven by the fact that the problem mostly goes away after the fight with Morgott at the base of the Erd Tree, the point at which the game becomes more linear and all the enemies and bosses get big health and damage boosts. The first on-foot boss I encountered after the Erd Tree was Commander Niall, so his fight was the first one for a while that forced me to pay attention and learn his patterns and timings, which is probably part of the reason I enjoyed it so much. Here are some quick thoughts on the other late game bosses. I thought the fight with Mohg was great, and the way he coats the arena in bleed juice is an interesting wrinkle that makes the fight feel more dynamic and forces you to consider placement just as much as timing when going on the offensive. The 3 unavoidable lifesteal hits he gets on you are sort of cheap, but forcing you to chug through flasks and lower your mistake threshold is fair enough at this late stage of the game. Radagon is a classic dodge and punish kind of boss. In fact, now that I think about it, a lot of his moves involve him winding up and closing the distance in a single swipe, leaving him open to an easy counterattack. The fact that he only serves as the intro to the real final boss means that FromSoft probably didn't want to go too far with him. I got lucky with Elden Beast and didn't seem to have the trouble with it that many others did. Chasing him across the arena is annoying, and so is his big boring move during which he can't be damaged, but the most irritating thing about his fight is that you can't see what the hell he's doing when you're up close. This is an issue with the camera that really shouldn't be in the game, and it shows up against other large enemies as well. Whoever decided the lock-on target of the Farum Azula dragons should be the base of their neck needs to be in jail. When a dragon flies up to do an aerial attack, it moves out of range of your camera, so you have no idea what attack is coming or when to dodge. This is awful, and I doubt FromSoft is happy about the way it works either. Millennia's lifesteal on successful attacks is a brilliant twist that I'm shocked hasn't been seen before in one of these games, and it increases the penalty for making a mistake in a really engaging way that will make your eyes go wide when you notice it and realise the game isn't fucking around anymore. For this reason, I think many would agree that she's the real final boss. The fact that she starts phase 2 on partial health and can end up having more health than she started with if she kills you is a particularly cruel twist of the knife that I found kind of funny. However, and you knew this was coming, her waterfowl dance move is total bullshit, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. The possibility of her doing it dictates the entire fight in a really unsatisfying and boring way. If she did it once at 75% health, it wouldn't be an issue, sort of like Mohg's unavoidable move. But the fact that she's capable of winding it up shortly after any other move means you'll be afraid to punish the end of any of her combos, the time when she's ordinarily most open to attack, and this turns the fight into a frustrating slog. It's a real shame because aside from this move, the challenge is fair, and it feels like a fitting climax to the game, especially with the lifesteal mechanic. I'd love to be able to go into more detail on the bosses from before the Erd Tree, but most of them are either overused to the point of becoming boring or easily ruined by coming across them with too high a level. There's room for a difference of opinion when it comes to this mid-game balancing issue. Some players would say that the game is rewarding you for exploration by giving you the resources to increase your stats and get one over on bosses. Others, myself included, would say that the game is punishing you for exploring by making every encounter into easy pickings. So how is it that people can disagree on such a seemingly fundamental part of the game? Well, I think part of the reason is that there are actually two kinds of skills tested by Elden Ring's combat, and by all FromSoft role-playing games. One is the skill of real-time execution, where you need to be knowledgeable or adaptable enough to roll at the right time, attack at the right time, and so on. But before combat even starts, there's also the skill of building a viable character by allocating your stats coherently and choosing the right weapons. The process of building your character features similar trade-offs to the actual combat itself. When you're fighting, every move you make has to be planned around a single resource, stamina. The same applies when you're improving your character or equipment, with the resource being runes instead. Just as rolling depletes stamina that could have been used for attacking, spending runes to level up one stat means not leveling up something else. You can increase vigor to get more health, or strength to do more damage. Pick one. It's the same kind of decision you have to make when you're actually in the middle of a fight, just over a longer timescale. Of course, given long enough you actually can level both stats, but assuming you don't deliberately grind runes, then you're likely to end the game with a level around the 150 range, with your points allocated in whichever stats you deemed most worthy. For some players, this stat allocation, build optimization metagame is the fun part of the game, and I can understand how finding ways to annihilate bosses with a handful of moves might be a fun and rewarding experience, even if the execution itself isn't that mechanically deep. In combat, Elden Ring can diverge into a completely different game depending on your chosen build and equipment. It could be a game about reflexes, or a game about numbers and stats, and this is usually up to the player to decide, when the horrendous balancing issues aren't making that choice for you. So let's just grab this one by the horns. Is Elden Ring hard? No, not really, but neither is Dark Souls. By this point, the series' reputation far precedes it as being the king of difficulty, but the thing is, most of these games are not that hard, they're really not. How can they be when you have such a wide variety of options for dealing with every problem? Getting good is not mandatory in these games because you always have the option of falling back on the numbers game and grinding to increase your stats to level your way out of a challenge, or just summoning an NPC or player to get you through it. This is why I've never understood the calls for an easy mode in these games. They already have an abundance of tools to make the game easier that have been there from day one, and you're actively encouraged to use them. The only catch is that you need to put in some work to make it happen, which is the entire point of the series. There needs to be some friction to make succeeding over a boss meaningful. Beating Margit on your first try would be boring, I think everyone can agree on that. But the first time he makes you lay your foolish ambitions to rest, you have to make a choice for yourself there and then. Do you want to dedicate your time to getting good enough to beat this fight as it is? Or do you want to go away and spend your time getting stronger so that the fight gets easier? Both answers to that question are valid, and both require an investment of time and energy from the player until they get good enough to beat him. It just comes down to whether you prefer playing a reflex game or a numbers game. It's obvious that the game was intentionally designed to allow the player to respond to problems in diverse ways and overcome challenges however they see fit. The shackle you can buy from patches that stuns Margit for a short time is the only proof you need of this. It's a reward you get for exploring that makes you more equipped to deal with a tough challenge, and it's up to you whether you want to get it or not. If you want to go away and grind levels for a difficult boss, it's more viable, and dare I say enjoyable, than ever before, because in Elden Ring, grinding isn't grinding, it's exploring. You don't need to go back to an old area to grind, you can press onwards to new areas and dungeons to find something new-ish until you want to try that boss again. Since Elden Ring is clearly a game all about freedom, I'd say it's a good thing that the player has these different options, but at the risk of beating a dead torrent, it's a huge oversight that the player is able to accidentally grind themselves so far ahead of the difficulty curve. The argument that you're only playing the game right if you go for a melee build and never use summons or magic just doesn't hold water at all, and I say this as someone who actually prefers to play the game that way myself. If anything, the fact that so many different types of build are viable yet distinct ways to beat the game is an impressive feat in design that mostly comes down to the trade-offs made when allocating stats each time you level up, which also serves as a kind of difficulty selection. Playing as a magic user gives you the ability to cast offensive spells from range, leaving you less vulnerable to enemy attacks and making it less likely you'll take damage. But if you want to use all different types of spells, then you'll need to level up Mind, Intelligence, Faith, and Arcane, leaving you with fewer points to spend in Vigor and Endurance, which would lower the number of mistakes you can make before dying. Some spells require an investment of over 60 Intelligence, which severely reduces the amount of points you have left for other stats. Every spell uses FP, and you need to replenish it just like your health in order to keep casting, but critically the resource used to do it is the same one used to heal, and you have to choose how to allocate that resource before entering a fight. Want to spend an entire boss fight running away and spamming magic? Well, you can, but you need to sacrifice some of your healing capability to make it possible. To reap the benefit of using a powerful spell, you have to enter the fight with a lower mistake threshold, and make extra sure you don't take damage. On paper, these efforts at balancing magic use are quite elegant, and on the number-crunching stats side of the game, I think they mostly result in fair trade-offs. On the reflex side of the game, however, the advantages brought by using ranged attacks far outweigh the disadvantages of lower health and endurance, often to the point where reflexes are no longer relevant to many fights. For this reason, I personally find playing a magic build to be quite boring, but if you enjoy playing that way, then by all means keep going. The differences in priorities between magic builds and melee builds are so divergent that they're hardly even playing the same game anymore, so arguing over which camp is playing correctly is a waste of time. If you're playing in a way that you find fun, just keep doing that. There's one last new addition to Elden Ring that's worth mentioning when it comes to difficulty. FP can also be used to summon spirit ashes in most boss rooms, NPCs that will fight on your behalf, and again there's a trade-off involved in their use, though it's a very minor one this time. To make your summons viable against later bosses, you need to devote some runes to upgrading them, runes that could also be used to increase your own stats, but the cost is relatively low. Since there's usually a big FP cost to using these ashes, you'll need to invest levels into Mind so that you have enough total FP to summon the more powerful ones. This can be quite easily counteracted by using a mixed physic that makes all spells cost 0 FP for a short while, which does come with a trade-off of its own by taking up one of your physics slots, but this is nothing compared to the immense benefit that comes with having one of these summons splitting the boss's attention for you. One of the most powerful summons, the Mimic tier, actually drains health rather than FP, so you can call for a massively overpowered NPC that will fight bosses on your behalf just for the cost of a single healing charge. If it lowered your maximum HP for the remainder of the fight, now we've got ourselves an interesting trade-off, but no, you can just heal it back instantly. Does summoning make the game easier? Undoubtedly, but so does upgrading your weapon or leveling up your character, and nobody arguing in good faith would say that the player is supposed to avoid doing that. I'm not completely against the idea of spirit ashes, but I do think they offer a bit too much reward for not enough risk, and are therefore in danger of making the game less interesting to play, a far greater crime than just making it too easy. Better balancing the trade-off to using them, or making the player specialize their character more for their use, would go a long way to making summoning a more interesting way to play. Elden Ring probably is the easiest Souls game, and it's likely no coincidence that it's also FromSoft's best seller by a wide margin. I have no problem at all with the game featuring tools and options that make the experience easier, as long as those options are woven into the game itself and not just found in a difficulty select menu. But the key word there is option. If the player is choosing to change the experience for themselves and tip the scales in their favour, then I don't see an issue with that, and that's been the case with the series since the very beginning. There is, however, a big problem when the game lets you move yourself along that difficulty slider unintentionally, because at that point it stops being a decision that the player has made. In a game that's ostensibly all about player freedom, being punished for visiting areas in the wrong order by having that decision about balance taken off them is terrible, and it's one of Elden Ring's biggest flaws. The overwhelming feeling I got from Elden Ring was that I'd seen it all before. The combat system is lifted almost entirely from Dark Souls 3, with plenty of enemies and even location designs copied over as well. Cheeky nod to previous games in the series, or trick to save time on designing new assets? You decide. The slight additions to combat are not enough to make Elden Ring feel distinct, and only interfere with the balance of a system that was already polished as far as it could go a decade ago. This formula really needs to be put to rest now. She had a good run FromSoft, but it's time to put the old girl to sleep. The open world is the only truly new thing about Elden Ring, and it's simultaneously the game's most impressive feature and the thing that drags everything else down. Moments like the ride down to the underground rivers and the teleport to the capital are enhanced and strengthened specifically because they exist in an open world where they contribute to a feeling that anything could happen. And every time you open a chest, interact with a portal, or descend into a cave, you'll be wondering in the back of your mind if it might lead to some new vista. 9 times out of 10, it doesn't, and all you get is a dungeon you've seen before, a boss you've fought before, and an item you'll never use. That sense of wonder and curiosity will carry you to the end of the game though, and crucially there are still some surprises waiting even at the end. In isolation then, the open world looks like a success, but the results are less positive when you consider how it interacts with the other elements of the game. First of all, the open world gives you the freedom to ignore most of the content in the game. Missing out on optional catacombs is one thing, but being able to completely trivialize a potentially interesting scenario by going around it or teleporting away from it is something else entirely. Secondly, if you do choose to investigate all of the optional content, you'll end up breaking the game's balance in half. Throughout the entirety of Elden Ring, there's an invisible tension between the loosely defined intended experience and the freedom that the player has to ignore it. Deviate from the correct path and go somewhere else for a while, and by the time you return you'll be over-leveled and will have missed out on the side quests, with no way to undo your mistake. But it wasn't your mistake. The game lets you do it, even encourages you to do it, and your reward is an unsatisfying experience that makes you feel like you've broken the game. But again, you didn't break it. The game is just broken. You know what game didn't have an issue with giving the player too much freedom? A little hidden gem from 2019 called Sekiro. It's a far more action-focused game where there are no choices to be made about stat allocation or equipment loadout. The developers can know with reasonable certainty exactly what kind of health and damage output the player will have at any given point in the game, and accordingly they can design encounters specifically tuned for those numbers. You're tied to one weapon and moveset throughout the entire game, and you can't summon or level up or magic spam your way through it. Unlike in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, there actually is a single correct way to play. Elden Ring lets you do everything on your terms, and I think it loses a certain part of the series' appeal because of it. Sekiro forces you to do things on the game's terms, and for this reason it's the exception to what I said about FromSoft's games not really being that hard. Is that more directed design why Sekiro became my favourite FromSoft game after the right way to play clicked with me? Probably yeah. Is it also why I gave up on my first playthrough when I just wasn't getting it? Almost certainly. If Sekiro was the culmination of everything FromSoft has learned about designing an action game, then Elden Ring is everything they learned about making a freeform RPG. Having now seen both extremes, I think I know which side I'm sitting on for their next game.